Welcome back. In a moment, we'll examine the crisis in Italy's banking system. But first, here are some other stories to keep an eye on. President-elect Donald Trump has once again courted controversy after he selected his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, as one of his top presidential advisors. The Democratic Party are calling for a review of the pick, citing concerns over nepotism. Hundreds of thousands of Iranians have turned out for the funeral of the former president, Akbar Hosseini Rafsanjani. The streets filled with people around the Tehran University campus where prayers were being held. And Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has met leaders from around the world at a global investor summit in the west of the country. The biennial event, initiated by the Prime Minister, is thought to bring billions of dollars of investment into India. Well, Italy is Europe's fourth largest economy, and it shrunk for around 10% in the last decade, during which it experienced 3 recessions. Its failure to keep pace with the recovery in the rest of the world has been blamed on the government's inability to take difficult decisions, not least regarding its banks. Italy's banks are in big trouble, and there are fears that unless they're saved, they could contribute to another financial crisis. The economy has been stagnant for decades, and nearly 1 in 5 loans made by Italian banks is classified as non-performing, meaning the borrower is unlikely to repay. The latest estimate by the Central Bank of Italy says there are roughly $373 billion worth of bad loans on the books of banks. Analysts warn the banks might only recover 20 to 50% of these debts. They need to raise some of those losses from other sources so they can remain solvent and trading.
The danger with the Italian banking system is it becomes effectively endemic throughout the entire system, and then when one falls, the rest of it starts collapsing.
The worst affected is the world's oldest bank, Monte dei Paschi di Siena, which has tried and failed to raise money from private investors, while other banks have been devising plans to cope. The government has put in place plans for a $21 billion rescue fund that can be drawn on by banks who cannot raise money by any other means. But Brussels is threatening to stand in the way after ruling that taxpayer bailouts are in breach of rules about state aid to companies. The European Central Bank says that troubled banks must pursue so-called bail-ins, which force existing investors to lose some of the value of their investment. That's a politically toxic issue in Italy, where many of those who've invested in banks are small-time investors whose lives could be ruined rather than large financial institutions that could sustain the loss. Well, to discuss that further, I'm joined by Gaurav Sharma, who's the business editor for the International Business Times. How close to collapse of Italy's system are we?
Well, we keep obsessing about Monte dei Paschi, but the one to look out for is UniCredit. They've applied for a $13 billion in terms of funds that they need to raise. They're letting go around 1,400 employees. It's going to get worse and worse. But the market seems to be obsessing about MDP. So if you look across the Italian banking board, you look at the big 5, almost all of them are not instilling anybody with a degree of confidence. So these are worrying times.
How do they keep going? I mean, if it wasn't Italy and it was another bank in another country, they'd have been shut down by now, wouldn't they?
Oh, definitely. If you rewind the clock back to the summer of 2016, when we had the first soundings that things are not going terribly well, the first thing was the classic Italian response, denial. They next moved on to conspiracy theories after Brexit had happened. Several Italian politicians, including Mario Monti, if my memory serves me well, said this whole Italian banking crisis is just being bumped up to take attention away from Brexit. How can you possibly take attention away from Brexit? And then finally, towards the end of November, December, they got their act together. They realized they've got a huge crisis on their hands and went into smoke. Anywhere else, you're perfectly right. Anywhere else, there's been a big hoo-ha. Whereas in Italy, this sort of this slow boil up, and suddenly, towards the end of, say December, we realized that MDP is not going to be able to raise cash. Suddenly, the Italian government steps in, and now the ECB is having problems with that.
Is it not a cultural thing whereby Italians, as a race, take a fairly relaxed idea to paying back a loan, and that this is now, you know, a phenomenon that's come home to roost on this scale?
Oh, definitely. You talk of non-performing loans. If you take across the world, any economy, every banking system has non-performing loans.
Yeah.
In Italy, it's the non-performing loans as high as 18 to 20%. If that would have been happening here, you'd have seen everybody in England, you would have seen the Treasury, the Chancellor, everybody scrambling. Whereas they seem to be thinking, well, you know, it's normal. It's not normal 20% of non-performing loans has all the hallmarks of crisis.
And as we look at Italy from this vantage point of just being a few thousand miles away, you see there doesn't appear to be much room for manoeuvre. Because if, say, a government might say, right, well, we've got a stagnant economy, got trouble with unemployment, let's invest, let's spend a load of government money to get the economy going. They can't even do that, can they?
Not much. There's not much room. We mentioned in your colleague's package that the Italian economy is the 4th largest economy. I think come the end of 2017, we might be the 8th largest. That's how bad it is. You look at youth unemployment, you look at banking sector problems, you look at possibly rising inflation. Take it all together, and there is not much positivity on the horizon.
Let's follow the doom-laden scenario. If one of these banks does finally be declared to be in default, it's non-functioning, it has to stop trading in some way, is this a contagion that then ripples across Europe and right up to Germany and France and all the other big players in the European economy?
It's bad, but I don't think it's that bad. AXA has exposure to Italian banks. We know that, especially MDP, it earns about a little over 4%. The Italian government has considerable exposure. The problem is if the Italian government has to step in a big way and its own finances are not in a perfectly good state, to put it mildly, it will have an impact on the bond markets. Now, Italy might fall to being the world's 8th largest economy by the end of 2017. Some say it's already there. But if you look at in terms of bond issuance, they're the 3rd largest bond issuer. So that's how the contagion might spread, although I do believe it won't be as bad as 2008, and it won't escalate, won't go to a global scale.
Could they leave the euro?
God, stranger things have happened, haven't they? You know, Brexit was without precedence. They could, now, if we rewind the clock back to the 60s and 70s, they devalued the lira, and north of Italy was Europe's powerhouse. They were doing terribly well, and of course they joined the euro. They no longer have that luxury. Will people in political circles, especially the right-wingers, the Beppe Grillos as well, saying, well, let's leave the euro, bring our competitiveness back? Yes, it could happen, but if that happens, it won't just be the Italians who worry.
Because are there some parallels with the Greek situation here? I mean, Europe has done everything it is to bully Greece into submission and to surrender to almost German controls as to what exactly they have to do to meet the conditions to continue receiving funds. I know Italy isn't quite there yet, but you could see that same dominance being applied to them, wouldn't it? If it's good enough for Greece, surely it would be good enough for Italy.
You see, we had some different rules applied to when the Spanish admitted they had problems. Now, if you look at all these data sets that Eurostat provides, you look at Italian unemployment, youth unemployment, it's at about 40%. That's a lot less. I mean, it's not as bad as Greece and Spain, where it's about 50%.
Yeah.
You look at the debt levels. You look at the problems of the banking sector. But yes, different rules were applied to Spain, and now, as it appears, are being applied to Italy. So they're not being squeezed as much as the Greeks, which of course is causing some consternation.
And they're not in the position actually of asking for help yet, are they? Because as you say, there's a lot of Italian confidence and bravado saying, oh, you know, it'll all blow over. It's not really a serious issue.
No, not at all. They still seem to think that they can sort it out on their own. Yes, they do have the maneuver. The Italian government could step in, so if permitted by the European authorities. But having said so, what impact would that have on Italy's headline growth, on its own debt levels? And then the whole thing starts festering again. So they don't have the luxury, but they think they do.
Which means, what do the rest of us think? You're clearly not going to invest in a major business proposition in Italy right now, because it almost certainly won't happen, would you?
Even if you're not very of a sound investment background, you were an individual investor, and now MDP tried a share issue, Unicredit is going to try. Do you seriously believe, for an individual investor, you think, let me buy shares in an Italian bank which has already admitted that it needs to raise 13 billion euros? So
it's not going to happen, is it, really?
I certainly won't do it, and I wouldn't recommend the viewers to do it either, but it's individual choice.
So what do you think is the next step in Italy's journey here? Do you see a crisis, or do you think another compromise and another muddle through?
The Italian government has to do what Hank Paulson did back in the crisis, pull out the bazooka. Just go across the board to all the major Italian banks and say, this is what we're doing, you need to accept this level of recapitalization, especially for your savers. When you do that across the board, not just with Monte dei Paschi or with Unicredit, you do it across the board, that's what gives the market some confidence. That's probably what they need to do.
Gaurav Sharma, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
We end our programme with the Insight Bite. This is a little something that we feel you should know. Today, it's an unusual Japanese tradition. Thousands of Japanese men and women have converged on a shrine in the west of the country to take part in the annual Lucky Man Run. The race is only 230 metres, and it's said that the winner is endowed with a year's worth of good luck. This year's winner was a university student called Takashi Suzuki. I'm sure he'll be hoping his luck will kick in around exam time. And that's all for now. I'm Martin Stanford. That was Insight.